There we go. So who can remind us what salvation was about? What is that story about? Give us a brief summary. Yeah.
So this little 13-year-old boy named Winston goes to a revival at the church and is pretty much told by everyone around him that he's going to be saved by Jesus, but he doesn't feel that connection, and he ends up leaving more disappointed and he loses his faith.
Yeah. Right? Yeah. So he goes to this kind of religious revival thing. The purpose is to, be like, hey, everybody, Jesus is great, accept him in your life. But the irony of the situation is that he's actually forced further away from Christ in this situation because of the expectations that like his aunt and the other adults in the situation press upon him. Okay, so in the video over the weekend, if you haven't watched it, you need to watch it because we go over different things. We added the last two things to your Diddles acronym for the rhetorical toolbox. So we talked briefly on there about language and then sentence structure. So who can remember what language was? Language. It's different than diction. What's diction? Let's look at my victim list out. Be quiet today. Let's go. Dora, what is diction?
Good morning, Tim. Do you please stand for the pledge? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Virtual Club Week is this week. Make sure to join your Canvas grade class to find out more about what clubs will be offered this year and to sign up.
Nominate someone for the Homecoming Royalty Ballot. Voting will happen on the grade Canvas classes.
Final voting starts Thursday, September 10th and goes through Friday, September 11th. Winners will be announced at the homecoming football game.
If you need technology assistance with Canvas, please only contact our district technology department at homesupport@provo.edu.
Picture Makeup Day is this week on Thursday, September 10th.
And musical callbacks are this Friday.
Sorry, the Picture Makeup Day is actually on the 14th and 15th. Good luck to our sports teams this week. Tuesdays, girls tennis, volleyball, golf, and soccer. Good luck. Thursday, soccer, tennis, volleyball, and Friday, good luck to cross country at their meet. For more information on their games, see the school calendar and Instagram.
And today's grab and go lunch is bean and cheese burrito, salsa, apple, carrot sticks, Doritos, 1% milk, chocolate milk, and skim milk.
If you purchased a yearbook last year but have not picked it up in the main office, please do so as soon as possible. Yearbooks not claimed by September 10th will be sold and you'll be issued a refund. There's also a white Honda Civic outside with its lights on. Thanks, if you have a good day.
Okay, cool. So, Dora, what is diction?
Diction is like a word choice.
Beautiful, right? Diction is word choice. And so language is different in diction because diction we're looking at individual words or maybe a few little phrases, right? Language is the overall use of language. So you're looking holistically at a piece and you're like, okay, this person is using, like maybe they're using an accent, right? So we call that like a dialect. And so you'll see that like written out stuff. And we'll see that a lot in the thing as we read through. They use like slang and a dialect. And that is a particular choice that Mark Twain uses to kind of highlight what he teaches about American culture. In Frederick Douglass, language is important because everyone expected him to be kind of a hick slave, right, who didn't really know anything. And yet, how did he speak? eloquently and educated, right? And so his overall use of language highlighted his intelligence and made him a more credible speaker to his audience, which is cool. Language is probably not something that you'll ever be like writing a whole essay about, but it can give you a few cool things to notice and say. Sentence structure. What is sentence structure? Let's ask Graham, what is sentence structure?
It's like how you set up sentences.
Yeah. Totally. So you're looking at just like the order of sentences. Sometimes it's called syntax. Many of you are programmers. It talks about syntax, like the way you put together your little program, right? And if you're out of order, the whole thing falls apart. Well, in a sentence, we have particular orders for things. Depending on the language you use, so like Spanish will often order things differently than we do in English, and you can tell when someone's learning the language because they often like default back to their old way of putting sentences together, and it can sound a little funny if they're speaking a different language that does that differently, right? And so sentence structure is something we want to pay attention to as we're reading, because the way that people order sentences are important. I talked about in your video, like over the weekend, that the important real estate for a sentence is at the beginning and end of sentences, right? If they say something at the beginning, they want you to remember it, or like at the end. Sometimes the stuff in the middle gets lost a little bit, right? You'd want to notice patterns in sentences. So if you notice a lot of really long sentences, also there's a very short one. So you want to pay attention to, right? Or vice versa, a lot of short choppy ones and then a long one. Do you notice patterns in the sentence structure? Okay, so those are important. So, looking at salvation, I'll pull that up. Salvation. I want to talk about the purpose of this piece. So we talked about what the piece was about. Actually, it's this. Okay, yeah, that's it right here. So it's about this young kid who goes to revival to meet Jesus, and yet he does not, and he feels pretty bad afterwards. What is his purpose in writing this piece? All right, we're gonna get you chatting with each other. So talk to someone next to you. Talk to them about the purpose. You should have written this in your little chart down here anyway, right? What did this analysis reveal about the story? How does it add to your understanding of the meaning of the passage? So you should have something for this. So tell them at least what you wrote there, okay? Speak to each other. That's why we're in in-person class.
Was like trying to show like that's not forcing people to try something, just like something that you know, putting too much pressure. What about you?
We still have some additional. Yeah, you can still submit it, just to make sure that you do. So I'll put in zeros and stuff, but I don't know that they're gonna take off a ton for late work. But like, people are falling behind, we're gonna be buried by the end of the term, and then they're sad when they feel that grade, because they go behind them. Okay, so, but you can still submit it. Okay, what is the purpose of this piece? Now remember, this is a safe space. We're trying to learn together, and purpose is a very important concept. We'll talk more about it in a second. So, what do you think the purpose of him writing salvation is? Why is he writing this? Yeah, Marie.
I think he was writing it, like we were talking about it, and we all
think that he wrote it to show that you can't really force anybody to believe in what you believe. You can't really force anybody to do something you want them to do just because.
Yeah, I just got shivers because you're so smart, right? So he's writing this because when you try to force someone to have an experience, whether it's like for a good purpose or bad, it doesn't end up usually working out the way that you want to. And especially with religion, trying to force someone to believe what you believe and to have like a spiritual experience is not going to work, right? Maybe this is terrible, and maybe I shouldn't say it because of like separation of church and state, but EFY was a rough thing for me as a teenager because you'd go to this like church camp, right, for a week, and they were just like, isn't it great? Religion is awesome, right? And it just kind of felt fake to me, and so like I had a really hard time enjoying that. Not that I don't believe in like religion and stuff, like, but for me, religious experiences were very personal, and then when we tried to create this communal atmosphere, I just felt like this feels wrong and weird to me. Now, if you love EFY, that is great. You keep loving it, right? Don't tell your parents, although I'm filming myself, so whatever. But it can be an awkward experience when you try to take something that's so private and personal and then say like, yeah, drink the Kool-Aid, right? So he's talking about the idea that we should not try to force other people to have these personal experiences and believe what we believe because it isn't right and it often leads to adverse effects. So some of the things that he talks about in here that help us see that purpose are pretty cool. What are some things he does that help us to see that that is his purpose in this piece? Or to kind of back up the purpose that we shouldn't try to get other people to believe what we believe. Okay, talk to your neighbor about it. Yay! And if you need to like move to chat with someone,
Yeah, I'm really
It's like, what does he do to show
doing as a writer to help you see what his purpose is and to emphasize and create his purpose in this piece. So these are kind of things from your rhetorical toolbox, right? So diction is he using, imagery, what details does he put in, what sentence structure? What did you guys find? Yeah.
Okay, well, the pastor often repeats questions like, why don't you come, like, why don't you be saved, like, repeats like quite a few times for a while, and that just sort of helps to show like how overwhelming the whole thing is.
Right? He, like, why don't you come? Why don't you come? And he says that, like, he'll say it like 3 or 4 times every time he says it. Oh, sorry, this is on Frozen. You guys may tell me I'm not actually showing words. But he says, why don't you come? And he like repeats it. But then it's not just that time, right? Like, first they ask, why don't you come? Then they ask again. Then he inserts his name, like, Langston, why don't you come? It's very overwhelming. So we see that angst and that experience for him and why maybe at the end he was like, fine, I saw Jesus, great, good, what else? Yes?
I think also he talks a lot about the church being hot and cramped, like using words that make you feel suffocating.
Yeah, right? We feel that heat. I don't know if you've ever been in a hot spot. I'm like a poet today. Like a hot spot before where you're like, and that just adds to that feeling of feeling overwhelmed. Or maybe it's like not even warm and you're just very warm because you are feeling a lot of nerves, right? have turned it in, I would be adding the stuff, because not any of one of us is probably gonna notice everything in the story, but together, we're gonna notice a lot of cool things. And the more that we listen to other people, and when we get to the AP test and we're like in front of a blank story, we'll know more things to mark, right? Anything else you guys notice that are helping to add to his purpose? The choices he's making. Yes?
Well, he mentions he like cries for the first time or whatever, and his aunt thinks it's okay to let it go, so she just sort of like blind to the reality of like what he's really feeling. He's just, I guess, sort of believe that that's the only possible thing that could have happened to him throughout this experience.
Totally, and I think throughout the piece, we see that a lot where the adults think that one thing is happening, but something completely different is happening in like the realm of the kid, right? So definitely when he cries at the end, his aunt assumes it's because he's feeling the spirit, and that's why, but really, he's lost his faith completely. Or like, when he's not coming up to sit on the bench because he's experienced Christ, everyone assumes he just doesn't want to, but really, he's being more faithful in holding out, right, until he actually experiences something. And so there's definitely like a dichotomy between what the adults think is happening and what is actually happening, and what the kids think are happening and what the adults perceive. Anything else? Okay, those are pretty good. So, the AP exam, right? One of your 3 essays is the analytical essay. And 100% of the time on the analytical essay, they will ask you about the purpose of the piece, and then what choices the author is making to accomplish that purpose, right? They may phrase it differently. Sometimes they'll even point out like particular parts of the story to kind of help you see these important parts. But then they'll say like, what is the author's purpose, and what does he do to accomplish that purpose, right? So it's very important that when you're reading stories, you're thinking like a writer, right? Where you're saying, why is this writer doing this? Like if I was writing this story, what is my purpose here? And then what techniques am I using as a writer, or what techniques is this writer using to then accomplish that purpose? Because when you write something and you have a purpose, you want to do everything you can in that story to help accomplish that purpose. So as we're talking, and especially in the beginning here, as we're like really digging into this text, it's so important because so much of what you do on that exam, even though you're writing an essay, is the thinking that goes into it, right? And so we want to make sure that we're able to comfortably identify that purpose and then talk specifically about things that are adding to that purpose, okay? Any questions about salvation before we put that one away? Okay, great. So we're going to talk today and have like an in-depth discussion about Superman and Me by Sherman Alexie. So pull that up on your computer. And you can always, if you prefer to like handwrite stuff, that's totally fine too. You can print it out and circle, do whatever, or you can just do it on the computer. Because it can be sometimes hard to have, like, if a teacher makes you print something out, you don't have a printer, or like your ink. I feel like my ink is always out because we're cheap and don't like to buy ink. So anyway, that makes it easier if you can do it on the computer. So, Superman and Me. Let me find. There it is. Okay. What is this story about? Give us a brief summary. Remember, you get like participation points for these easy ones. You should just like, that's mine. Yes.
It's about like a Native American kid who like learned to read using comics and stuff.
Totally.
And then is kind of like left out because the expectation of his culture is like they weren't supposed to be able to read well or do things very well, and so it's just kind of a different experience for him. He decided to stand out.
Perfect. Yeah, we've got this Native American kid who lives on the reservation, and his story of learning to read, but also this feeling of like, by doing that, he's being ostracized by his culture, who's like, you're too good for us type thing. This author writes a lot of books about like the Native American experience growing up. He writes a book called The Absolutely True Diary of a Part-Time Indian, and he talks about how like as a kid he decides not to go to school on the reservation school, but rather like in like the public US school system. And he's kind of viewed like a traitor by his, by the same people that live on the reservation, because they're like, are you too good for our reservation school? But unfortunately, reservation schools are not usually that great because they have a much smaller pool to work from, so they're usually trying to find Native American teachers, so just anytime you like, we only wanna pull from this one population, you just have less to choose from. But they also don't have the same funding that the US government gives to schools, and so they're usually not as good. And so he chooses to go to a public school, and the people on the reservation take that to mean that he's too good to go to that school. So we see that experience, so good job, Graham. Okay, so sorry, did I get that name? I always do that. Joshua, and you're Graham. I'm gonna get this, kidding. I'm gonna read through the first two paragraphs, and I want you to look for patterns that you notice. And you're gonna use all of your rhetorical toolbox for these patterns. You may have already found some as you did your homework. You can add to those, if you haven't done it yet. Take this as a bonus opportunity to get a head start on the homework you didn't do, so, right? Okay, I'm gonna read through it, and I want you to tell me the patterns you notice and how you think they're adding to purpose, or if you can tell yet what his purpose will be. All right, I learned to read with a Superman comic book. Simple enough, I suppose. I cannot recall which particular Superman comic book I read, nor can I remember which villain he fought in that issue. I cannot remember the plot, nor the means by which I obtained the comic book. What I can remember is this. I was 3 years old, a Spokane Indian boy living with his family on the Spokane Indian Reservation in eastern Washington state. We were poor by most standards, but one of my parents usually managed to find some minimum wage job or another, which made us middle class by reservation standards. I had a brother and 3 sisters. We lived on a combination of irregular paychecks, hope, fear, and government surplus food. My father, who was one of the few Indians who went to Catholic school on purpose, was an avid reader of westerns, spy thrillers, murder mysteries, gangster epics, basketball player biographies, and anything else he could find. He bought his books by the pound at Dutch's Pawn Shop, Goodwill, Salvation Army, and Value Village. When he had extra money, he bought new novels at the supermarkets, convenience stores, and hospital gift shops. Our house was filled with books. They were stacked in crazy piles in the bathroom, bedrooms, and living room. In a fit of unemployment inspired creative energy, my father built a set of bookshelves and soon filled them with a random assortment of books about the Kennedy assassination, Watergate, and the Vietnam War, and the entire 23 series of the Apache Westerns. My father loved books, and since I love my father with an aching devotion, I decided to love books as well. Okay, talk to someone next to you, your neighbor, about the patterns and things that you notice in this story so far. Go.
No, but I really appreciate that you know how much it is because I feel like it gives the reader more of an understanding of how much has been.
You like did talk about it. Yeah, it was like really bad.
Alright, we got one. So what do you notice? What patterns do you notice in these first 2 paragraphs? Lauren, what's something you noticed?
I just noticed that he talked about his dad a lot, and I can't really mention anything else in that family. He just talked about the father.
Okay, and why would that be an important detail, do you think?
I don't know, maybe it's like part of what they believe or like how their community is, that the father's like, I don't know, has like a more important role.
Okay. Yeah, but it's important to notice that he doesn't talk about his mom, so you'd be asking yourself like, why does he leave that out? Or like, why does he focus so much on the dad? So that's good. What else do you guys notice? What patterns? Let me ask Khalil, what's something that you notice? very important to notice, right? So he starts talking about his background, right? He talks about, we were poor by most standards, but one of my parents usually managed to find some minimum wage job or another. So how many of his parents are usually employed? One, right? So one or the other. And yet, even though they're making minimum wage and it's like one parent, they're usually middle class by reservation standards, which tells us what about the reservations? They're quite poor, right? They talk about how they live on a combination of irregular paychecks, hope, fear, and government surplus food. What's interesting about that sentence? Okay, hope, how is hope different than what else is in that sentence? Okay, yeah, everything else kind of seems negative, right? Although, like, I guess government surplus food is better than no food, but that one definitely stands out. How are hope and fear different than government surplus food and irregular paychecks? Yeah, so he's got like these physical things, right? And inside he's hidden hope and fear, right? Like bookended by these two physical objects. I feel like in doing this, he kind of is like, okay, here's the practical things, but inside we are freaking out and we're hopeful too, right? So he's hiding those things by the concrete items that most people would see. So I think that's just kind of an interesting way to put that sentence together. He finds, where does his dad find the books? At thrift stores, right? My family was not super well off, so we shopped a lot at Value Village in Oregon, just because I had like 4 other siblings, so that was like a lot of kids to provide stuff for. But they found books there, and that's where he finds them. So they're poor, and yet, like we said, they find money to spend on books, which will become important to the purpose, right? Any ideas about what his purpose is so far? All right, yeah, I think that it's mostly background here, and I don't think we've really gotten into the heart of why he's writing this yet, but we have noticed some important things. Any other patterns you want to talk about? Okay, yeah.
I just like how much information we put in the second paragraph. Because he could have just said my father likes books and would have summed it all up. But I like that he put in so much detail so that the reader gets kind of a chance to better understand just how much his father loves books.
Yeah, good, right? And he puts in those like details. These are kind of like, I don't know what I think that Native Americans read, but I don't know that I would have put like Watergate and Kennedy assassination, right? But his dad is kind of like this eclectic guy, right? And it gives us just like a little bit more connection with him when we see how much he loves it. And it's not that, and his son definitely is noticing, right? To the point where he can say he had all of these kinds of books. I love that. Anything else? All right, I'm gonna read you the next few paragraphs. And I want you again to look for patterns that you notice. So you're looking for things in diction, details he adds, sentence structure, imagery. There's not a ton of imagery in this particular story, but I think there are a lot of important details which we're already picking up on, and other things going on. Okay, this mess was poking me in the face. Sorry. I can remember picking up my father's books before I could read. The words themselves are mostly foreign, but I still remember the exact moment when I first understood with a sudden clarity the purpose of a paragraph. I didn't have the vocabulary to say paragraph, but I realized that a paragraph was a fence that held words. The words inside a paragraph worked together for a common purpose. They had some specific reasons for being inside this same fence. This knowledge delighted me. I began to think of everything in terms of paragraph. Our reservation was a small paragraph within the United States. My family's house was a paragraph distinct from other paragraphs of the LeBrays to the north, the Fords to our south, and the tribal school to the west. Inside our house, each family member existed as a separate paragraph, but still had genetics and common experiences to link us. Now, using this logic, I can see my chain love the picture. I cannot read the words, but I assume it tells me that Superman is breaking down the door. Aloud, I pretend to read the words and say, Superman is breaking down the door. Words, dialogue also flow out of Superman's mouth. Because he is breaking down the door, I assume he says, I am breaking down the door. Once again, I pretend to read the words and say aloud, I am breaking down the door. In this way, I learn to read. Okay, discuss with your neighbor what patterns you notice or details that are important. What you think his purpose is. Go! Speak! To each other. That's it, that's all you have. Alright, what do you guys notice? Maddie, what's something you notice?
I think like, just from like what you were saying, I think that like, it just gave out a really big person parents to learn how to read.
Okay.
Really jumped out at me.
Why does his particular experience make you think that like it took a lot of perseverance for him to read?
Because he's talking about how he's like inferring that, what's going on. And he's like doing it again and again. So it's like, once again, he like pretends to say it, so he's like doing it over and over again.
Okay. Yeah, so he just did a lot of repetition there and learning to read. You really have to deliberately want that love. Okay, what else do you guys notice? Big things, patterns of either things he's talking about, images, details. Hello, do you have one? Like it's almost a hand. Let me go with it. No. What was something you noticed in this? Good. Good. So I like that even though you're like, I'm not quite sure why he's doing that, you're noticing those patterns, because that is the first step in being able to say something about it. So he talks a ton about paragraphs. What does he compare the paragraph to? Okay, his family. And before that, he says a paragraph is like a fence, right? And so he's noticing that there are like boundaries between things. He's comparing something that is literal, a paragraph, and easily understood, to the world, which is a lot less easily understood. Do you know what that particular literary device is called? It's called an analogy. Okay, and analogies are important because on the AP exam they'll ask you a lot about analogies. So analogies compare two things that are not like each other in order to gain some insight from it. They're a lot like a simile, except for a simile is usually like one little sentence, right? An analogy is an extended kind of explanation of this thing. So, so in this case, he's making the analogy between a paragraph and other things in his life, right? So his family, he talks about comparing a paragraph to even like the panels on comic books, right? So he's starting to look at the relationship between things. And then he talks about how his family is like an essay of paragraphs, right? So now he's linking things together and seeing the connections, right? So analogy is something that you want on your radar. If you notice an analogy, that's something you could talk about on the AP exam, right? And then you also talked about how he says breaking down the door a ton, right? He repeats it over and over. So you would want, just like Hillel there, to ask yourself, why is he doing that, right? And this will come up later in the story, so it's good that you noticed it now. Anything else you guys notice in those paragraphs? be an interesting story all by itself. A little Indian boy teaches himself to read at an early age and advances quickly. He reads Grapes of Wrath in kindergarten. And just so you know, like, we're reading Grapes of Wrath this year, so, and it's a challenging text, so it's an impressive feat. When other children are struggling through Dick and Jane, if he'd been anything but an Indian boy living on the reservation, he might have been called a prodigy. But he is an Indian boy living on the reservation and is simply an oddity. He grows into a man who often speaks of his childhood in third person, as if it will somehow dull the pain and make him sound more modest about his talents. A smart Indian is a dangerous person, widely feared and ridiculed by Indians and non-Indians alike. I fought with my classmates on a daily basis. They wanted me to stay quiet when the non-Indian teacher asked for answers, for volunteers, for help. We were Indian children who were expected to be stupid. Most lived up to those expectations inside the classroom, but subverted them on the outside. They struggled with basic reading in school, but could remember how to sing a few dozen powwow songs. They were monosyllabic in front of their non-Indian teachers, but could tell complicated stories and jokes at the dinner table. They submissively ducked their heads when confronted by a non-Indian adult, but would slug it out with the Indian bully who was 10 years older. As Indian children, we were expected to fail in the non-Indian world. Those who failed were ceremoniously accepted by other Indians and appropriately pitied by non-Indians. Okay, talk to each other. What do you notice? The more you engage in this, the better you're going to be. This is fun.
He was like comparing how smart he was too.
Also with him, like, you know, I guess I read after that, but if you fail, you're in work for like 90 years, then you learn something. What if you didn't fail, then you learn more about showing truth?
Okay, what do you notice? What's going on here? Yeah, Dora.
We just like talked about how these two paragraphs really talk about how the Indians were treated and how like one that I noticed was that one sentence was that if he'd been anything but an Indian boy living on the reservation, he might have been called a prodigy. This just shows that like it's expected to be not as smart where he is, and that if you were smart, then you'd get like shunned, I guess. But if you were like, because then in the last paragraph it says those who failed were ceremonially accepted. It shows that like it's more common to be not as smart.
Good. Yeah, and it's kind of like expected by their culture, right? I love that first sentence too of the second paragraph that I read. A smart Indian is a dangerous person, widely feared and ridiculed by Indians and non-Indians alike, right? And so he's really showing that he's trying to navigate this space where like he can read, he can receive an education, and yet on both sides he's kind of getting flack, right? And the people on the reservation who think that he's saying about their culture, it's not good enough for me, right? You're not expected to act this way, and you're kind of a traitor. But then also on the other side, you know, the expectations for Native Americans is that they won't be that good, right? And so I love, like you said, in these two paragraphs, he's definitely honing in on this fact. Other things that you noticed. Yes.
They were talking about how like they like had the ability to do a lot of stuff, but just because they were in that position, they wouldn't like reach out and maybe like because it would be like weird.
Yeah. Because like he talks about how like they were monosyllabic, which is like a great word, in front of their non-Indian teachers, but then could tell complicated stories and remember a lot of powwow songs, right? So it wasn't that they weren't able to, it's that that's not what was expected or like encouraged, right? So I like, again, that he hits on it. It's not that they don't have the ability, it's that culturally it's kind of unacceptable, right? Good. Anything else? Okay, I'm gonna keep going. I refused to fail. I was smart. I was arrogant. I was lucky. I read books late into the night until I could barely keep my eyes open. I read books at recess, then during lunch, and in the few minutes left after I had finished my classroom assignments. I read books in the car when my family traveled to powwows or basketball games. In shopping malls, I ran to the bookstores and read bits and pieces of as many books as I could. I read the books my father brought home from the pawn shops and secondhand. I read the books I borrowed from the library. I read the backs of cereal boxes. I read the newspaper. I read the bulletins posted on the walls of the school, the clinic, the tribal offices, the post office. I read junk mail. I read auto repair manuals. I read I read magazines. I read anything that had words and paragraphs. I read with equal parts joy and desperation. I loved those books, but I also knew that love had only one purpose. I was trying to save my life. Okay, I feel like that paragraph has so much to talk about. Talk about that. I believe in you, Maggie.
You know how when talking about his dad, how that book's so gratifying. He's doing it for like it's such a meaning and really kind of been carrying something like his it's like some of that
I don't know.
Okay, what do you notice? This paragraph is very cool. So what do you notice? Let's ask Joshua, what's something you noticed?
So I just noticed that he wanted to read as much as possible because he realized that the more he read and learned, the better he could make his situation like later on in his life.
Good, nice. So he emphasizes what he read, right? Are there choices he's making as a writer that add to that emphasis?
Just like describing all the, just like keeps on going on and on about all the different times that he goes and reads the book. Just like the whole paragraph, just all the different times.
I mean, yeah, he writes a lot about it, and Mary over here said that he uses a lot of repetition, right? So the way that he's saying it is very repetitive, right? He says like, I read. He's saying that over and over and over again. Is he saying that because he doesn't know how else to say it? No, he's making a deliberate choice as a writer. So repetition typically talks about like one word that's repeated. When we have repetition in like the way that the sentence goes, like sentence structure repetition, we call this parallel structure. Have you guys heard that word before? Okay, parallel structure is when the way that you're writing the sentence, like the verb is like the same, it's like the same pattern. So if you said like something like I read books, I mop the floor, and I go to the store, which one doesn't fit in that? Which sounds weird. The last one, because I shouldn't say like, here, I'll write it on the board so it's easier for you to see. So if I were to say, let's see here. Erase this, find my marker, on this, here we go. Okay, so if I were to say something like, I went swimming and boating and I read. Which one doesn't fit the pattern? And I read, because right now we've got a pattern of like ing, so I went boating, swimming. So what should this be? Yeah. I went boating. I guess I went swimming, boating, and reading. That kind of sounds weird, but you can, whatever verb that is down here should have the ing right here, right? You could also do it like the two, so like, I went to swim, to boat, and to read, right? Like, parallel structure is when they're all using the same structure for doing it. So it doesn't have to be the same like word. So in this case, he says, I read, he's using the exact same words and stuff. But it could be like, I read, I cried, and use like those past tense verbs and still have parallel structure. So you'll be wanting to look as you go through a text for parallel structure. Speeches have a ton of parallel structure because they want their audience to remember and resonate and see what's important. So if you use parallel structure in speeches, people are like, oh yeah, I should remember that. That's important and that sounds intelligent, right? So parallel structure is another thing you're going to want to add, kind of under sentence structure, is parallel structure. That's a pattern of sentence structure. Okay, so we have this pattern of I read, and then all of the billions of things that he read. Emphasizing how much he read. And then that last line, right here. Okay, so that last line, he says, I was trying to save my life. That's like a very impactful statement, right? Just by reading, he's trying to save his life. What do you notice about the rhythm of I read, that kind of emphasizes that trying to save life sentence at the end? What does that sound like? Dun, 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 dun. Does that make you think of anything? Any other sound? What? What does it make you think of? Heartbeat. Oh, heartbeat, right? Like you've got like this, like it's emphasizing just like your heart is very important to survival, and like when you think about someone who's dying, or you're trying to save them or give them CPR, right? You're like helping their heart to beat. So he read, and like that important life-saving element is emphasized just in like the rhythm of this repetition, right? And the fact that he goes on and on and on, I read, it kind of creates like that anxiety that you would get trying to save your life and showing how important it is. That's awesome. That's so cool that he does that, right? This is stuff we love to talk about in English. Okay, I'm gonna read you the last paragraph, and then we'll bring it all together, talk about purpose, and like if I was writing an essay on this for the exam, what we would talk about in that essay. So it says, despite all the books I read, I am still surprised I became a writer. I was going to be a pediatrician. These days I write novels, short stories, and poems. I visit schools and teach creative writing to Indian kids. In all my years in the reservation school system, I was never taught how to write poetry, short stories, or novels. I was certainly never taught that Indians wrote poetry, short stories, and novels. Writing was something beyond Indians. I cannot recall a single time that a guest teacher visited the reservation. There must have been visiting teachers. Who were they? Where are they now? Do they exist? I visit the schools as often as possible. The Indian kids crowd the classroom. Many are writing their own poems, short stories, and novels. They have read my books. They have read many other books. They look at me with bright eyes and arrogant wonder. They are trying to save their lives. Then there are the sullen and already defeated Indian kids who sit in the back rows and ignore me with theatrical precision. The pages of their notebooks are empty. They carry neither pencil nor pen. They stare out the window. They refuse and resist. Books, I say to them. Books, I say. I throw my weight against their locked doors. The door holds. I am smart. I am arrogant. I am lucky. I am trying to save our lives. Okay, talk to each other, full circle. What things do you notice? What things are brought back at the end there? What is its purpose? Talk. All right, then. Go die.
Alright, so kind of he reads and we can see through lines as we
Okay, what patterns do you notice? What are things that you notice that are important to his purpose in this paragraph? What is his purpose? Anything? Yes.
To like, teach other people his ways so that they can, have a better life.
Okay, good. So, and specifically, what will help them have a better life?
Reading.
Reading, right, and getting that education. Okay, who do you think his audience is? Who are these people he's trying to convince? Other Native Americans, right? And how do we know that? Well, we know that by looking at some of the things you guys already talked about as we were going through. He thinks about, okay, my purpose is to let Native Americans know that like reading is important, and that they can do it, right? And that it will change their lives for the better. And so he thinks probably about the arguments they would make for why they can't do it, right? Why can't they do it? Well, in the first part, he talks about his background, right, and how poor he is. And yet, what does his family have the money to buy? Books, right? He has tons of books. So he takes away that argument from them, like, okay, you might not think that you can read because you don't have the money, but that's bogus, right? What else does he say that he read that would negate the argument of like we don't have money to read? Yeah, he read the back of cereal boxes, right? He's like, I read those. I read auto repair manuals, right? He read anything that he could. Again, negating the argument that like, oh, well, we don't have anything to read or we don't have money to buy things to read. Okay? And what's another argument people might make for not being able to get an education as a Native American? Okay, right? He talks about the idea that like, okay, there's the Native American culture and then there's like the US culture, right? And because he was reading, how did he fit into those cultures? Right? He was an oddity between the two. And so another argument that people can make is like, well, people, like, I won't be accepted by our culture if I read, right? Or like, it doesn't even matter if I do because the white people will think I'm weird too, right? And he takes that away. He's like, yes, I was an oddity, but it was so important. So he says like, yeah, I know culturally you might feel that way, but it is still so important that you read, right? What else does he bring back in this last paragraph that would be important to note? Yes, Dora. And he has said that before, right? And it's interesting, here he says that we are trying to save our lives. The first time, what does he say? My life, right? So now he's taking it like, yes, I was trying to save my life. And that's like, okay, but what's cooler is that like, I am trying to save our lives. I'm trying to apply this to other people like myself, which takes and makes the piece like a lot more important than if he was just talking about his own personal experience, right? We even see that in his use of pronouns in the end, right? The first part of that paragraph, the paragraph before, is like I. Then what does that pronoun change to? Look at that one. They, right? So like I, okay, they, and then the last one is our, bringing it together, right? So I love that. Anything else that comes back at the end that we've seen before? I feel like there's something glaringly obvious. Lillian, do you know anything that's brought back at the end that we've seen before?
I'm not sure.
Okay, that's fair. We see that he's breaking down the door. Where have we heard that before? Yeah, right? So he talks about Superman before, because like Superman is breaking down the door. Now who's breaking down the door? He's trying to break down the door, right? But the door, it says, is locked. Okay, how do doors get locked? People lock them. And do they lock them from the outside or the inside? Usually the inside locking the outside out, right? So in order to unlock those doors, who has to do it? The people inside, right? So these little Native American kids who are choosing not to read, to not engage in their class. They're the only ones who can unlock it, right? So, you know, he's trying, he's doing his best to be Superman, but at the end of the day, you have to be the one to decide to break down that door for yourself. And so, again, adding to his purpose, which is to show Native Americans the importance of reading and how it can better their lives. Well, you have to decide to do that. I can't do it for you, right? Very cool stuff. So if I was writing an analytical essay on this, like they asked me, here is Superman, what is Sherman Alexie's purpose and how does he accomplish that? What choices does he make? What are some things I could talk about that are in here that are then helping him to accomplish his purpose? What are some techniques we've talked about? Or that you noticed as well?
We talked about the
Totally, right? So I could talk about for a whole paragraph, like repetition, right, of the I read. And I could say, like, you know, this is showing how important it is. He repeats that to emphasize the importance of reading. So I could talk about that repetition that I see there. What else could I talk about? I might talk about that I, they, and our pronoun thing, right? So he's talking about his own experience, he applies it to they, and then to our. So again, showing that. I could talk about the details he puts in and how he negates like everything that people could say for why they can't learn to read, right? So he really kind of takes away those arguments. So about him being so poor, the cultural divide, and all of that, and just saying that these are not good enough reasons not to read. I could talk about that Superman analogy or the paragraph analogy and talk about how that's adding to its purpose. So when you're looking for techniques, you're trying to think, okay, like if I write an essay about this, how could I talk about how this particular technique adds to the overall purpose of the piece and it helps them achieve that? So you kind of like to think of like a running total and then pick your best ones, because when you write the essay, usually you've got like a brief intro that has your thesis statement and then 2 body paragraphs. Each body paragraph you want to pick like one of the main techniques, find examples from the text that support it, and then say how that's helping the author to accomplish his purpose. And then your last paragraph is just like a mini conclusion. It's like usually pretty quick because you only have about 40 minutes to be writing these and about 5 minutes to read through the passage and quickly kind of find what they're looking for. Often they will give you like a little hint, like they'll talk about a particular part of the passage, so that can help you know where to start looking. But you'll want to be thinking about what patterns you're noticing that help to accomplish purpose. Okay? Any questions about Superman? Okay, cool. So you can turn that in if you're done. If you're not, add to it and turn it in on Canvas. This week for homework, you are going to, we read also this weekend, The Stranger in the Photograph Is Me, a quick story about this old man looking back at a war picture of himself and feeling like, wow, like that person is a completely different person than I am, and I almost don't recognize them. You are going to write, like your first big paper in this class is a narrative, and we're going to call it a photo narrative assignment. So what you're going to do this week in order to prepare for that is find a photo from your own life that you could use to write a story as like a bounce off point. Like for me, if you've had my class before, I may have told you, but my house burned down when I was in 3rd grade, and I got like the investigation report later on in my life from the fire department, and then wrote a story kind of inspired by some of those pictures. So you want to think maybe of like an impactful part of your life and a photo from that. But I want you to find a photo this week that could inspire like a narrative. You don't necessarily have to write about the photo, but you could write about like the experience or, but something that will be impactful, because the assignment, basically your purpose is you're going to share something from your life's experience in a relatable and meaningful way. So this is all on Canvas. If you look in the weekly overview, I always have like detailed what we did in class and what you need to do at home. And so this is in like that last part of it. where it says for homework this week in preparation for class, you'll need to. So you can look over this and we'll talk more about that in depth next time. And then this week you're also reading Champion of the World and Fish Cheeks, which are both pretty short, and you're annotating them. They don't have like the diddles chart at the end, because now we should be pretty good at annotating for those things, and so you don't need to have a separate chart at the end to put everything. You're just gonna annotate on the draft. I graded your first, a set of annotations from everyone. A lot of them are missing, so if you're missing, turn them in. But if you missed points on it, it was usually because they were either sparse, so you weren't making a ton of annotations, and especially where we talk about a lot of them in class, you should be adding that to yours. Or you like highlighted things, but you didn't really analyze what those patterns were doing. And remember, it's cool to notice patterns. It's a good idea. Like, you're like, okay, that's cool. But really, the whole purpose in finding patterns is to then analyze what they're doing to help the author accomplish their purpose. So you want to be making those notes in the margin, okay? All right. Have a great week. Was everyone here last time? You got books?